All right, we're looking at Joshua chapters 6 through 10. We have 5 stories here that we're looking at. And for each of these stories, we want to ask the same set of questions. The first question is, was there any communication with God in this passage? So let me give an overview of the stories that we're looking at. Joshua chapter 6, this is the story of the taking of Jericho, the walls of Jericho, the battle of Jericho. Joshua chapter 7, verses 1 through 5 is the battle of Ai, the first battle of Ai, in which the Israelites go and are defeated by the men of Ai, and they have to flee from them. Joshua chapter 8, verses 1 through 22 is the second battle of Ai, in which the Israelites are victorious and they are successful in defeating the people of Ai. Joshua chapter 9 is the story of the Gibeonites who, with deceit, are able to trick the Israelites into making an alliance with them, making them to believe that they are from far away when actually they are near and neighbors. And so they do that so the Israelites don't destroy them. Because they make an alliance with them, then they have to honor that alliance, which goes into chapter 10. And that is the story where the other nations of Canaan come against the Gibeonites. And then because the Israelites made a covenant with them, an alliance with the Gibeonites, they have to go and defend those same Gibeonites in chapter 10. All right, so was there any communication with God in this passage? Of course, Joshua chapter 6, explicitly, God told them what to do. Yes, there was communication. Joshua chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, no. Because of Achan's sin, that's actually why they lose the battle. That's why they are chased away. But the strange thing is that there was no communication. They did not seek God for any counsel on this battle. They go into the battle without God and they're defeated without God. Joshua chapter 8, verses 1 through 22, after Achan is found out to have sinned and he and his family are killed in the end of chapter 7, chapter 8 now, there is communication with God, and God tells them the good way or a wise way of laying an ambush so that they're able to defeat the people of Ai. Yes, there is communication with God there. Chapter 9 with the Gibeonites, the first case here, no, is explicitly stated in chapter 9, verse 14. The Israelites sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. They did not seek God. So no communication with God there. Chapter 10, we do have communication with God here, and God tells them what to do and that He's with them in this battle. So in overview of the 5 stories, chapter 7 and chapter 9, there is no communication with God. The second question, which did God give? Wisdom, miraculous help, or nothing at all? We'll first start with the 2 where they didn't ask God. Where they didn't ask God, He didn't give anything. That's chapter 7 and chapter 9 with the Gibeonites and with the first battle of Ai. In chapter 6, we all know the story. The walls of Jericho come tumbling down. So what did God give there? Miraculous help. God answered their request for help, and God gave them miraculous, divine, supernatural power to accomplish this victory. Chapter 8, the second battle of Ai, is very interesting, and it brings up a point that I think is very significant for us as Christians to realize. Here, they do have communication with God. They do ask God what they ought to do, and God gives them direction. But God gives them wisdom. God tells them how, as I said, to set an ambush for the people. This is in chapter 8 of Joshua, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you and go up and attack Ai. For I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, this city. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves." But here it is, set an ambush behind the city. And so God tells them, in the first battle of Ai, they only took 3,000 men. They didn't take the entire army. Here, God tells them, take the entire army, and also God tells them an ambush. And if you read the story, it's a very clever approach that God gives them, a wise approach that they're able to take the city. But the answer to the question is, God did not give them supernatural, miraculous, divine help. God gave them divine wisdom. God gave them a plan. God gave them instruction as to what to do. A person could look at this battle and say, this wasn't any God involved. This wasn't supernatural. The Israelites were just smarter. But they would have to acknowledge the Israelites knew that this wisdom came from God. And this is a very important point for us as Christians to gather. We should not feel that God has not answered our prayer if we don't see something supernatural happening. Many times we see in the Bible, old here and in the New Testament as well, that God answers the prayers of His people. God gives help to His people by simply giving wisdom, by simply giving a good idea, simply giving a better approach than the approach they would have taken on their own. And that is seen as much as the hand of God with them as when the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. And I think we need to, as Christians, focus on that. Many times we need to just come to God and claim that promise from James that if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. Not always should we expect God to do something miraculous, to move in some ways. And this also applies very directly in the health realm. Sometimes we pray for people and we feel that, well, God didn't answer our prayer because there was no miraculous healing. Well, God did answer the prayer by giving wisdom to the physicians, giving wisdom to you to know what supplements, what remedies, what diets, what change in lifestyle to go on to heal that thing. But that's just like what he did here in Joshua chapter 8. It's just as much the answer to prayer by God as it is when we see suddenly the cancer is gone. But this, again, is an expression of that principle, which, as I mentioned, is in the Old and New Testament. Sometimes God answers by wisdom. Again, chapter 9, there was no response from God because there was no question of God. Chapter 10, we see here that God worked with him by supernatural power as well. It says God sent hailstones to destroy their enemy in this case. And also Joshua commands and the sun stands still, which of course is miraculous help there. Next question, when God was involved, was the effort done by mostly God or mostly Israel, or both equally? In chapter 6, largely it was God. God brought the walls down. Yes, they had to go in and fight and burn the place, but there wasn't that much. Mostly God did that. In chapter 7, God wasn't involved. In chapter 8, God was involved, but mostly the work was done by Israel. Again, this brings up a very important point. We ought not think because there's no supernatural divine effort put forth that it's not God working. Yes, the people had to do it. They had to go out there and fight the people. They had to put their effort in their combat to destroy their enemy. But it was just as much God working with them, doing this and accomplishing this victory as it was in the walls of Jericho when God knocked down the walls. Again, for us as Christians, we ought not to think because we are laying plans that it's not God moving. We need to get out there and work. We're talking about trying to bring souls into the knowledge of the truth. We want people to know about Jesus. We need to do some work. Yes, seek God for wisdom, pray and ask God for wisdom, but we should not say, well, God's just going. Sometimes he does do that. Sometimes he does knock the walls of Jericho down. Sometimes atheists are converted by a dream. Sometimes Muslims just come and say, God told me to come to your church. Yes, that happens sometimes, but sometimes God also expects us to think, to plan, to strategize, to learn the demographics of the neighborhood, learn the people that we're trying to reach, learn the history of our neighbors, learn the peculiarities of our coworker, and do something. Sometimes there's a lot of effort that we have to put forth, and it's still God working. It's still God, just like he did in the second battle of Ai in Joshua chapter 8. He didn't do anything in chapter 9. Again, but chapter 10 again shows a principle, but I think this is a very important one. In this, unlike Jericho, unlike the second battle of Ai, there's an equal share. It's like what Paul says to his letter to the Corinthians. They're co-laborers together with God. I want to point out this thing that it says in chapter 10 of Joshua. This is here in the end of verse 14. It says, there has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being, because Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and God did it. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. It puts God as though he's a champion warrior in the army of Israel. He's working with them. Again, the Israelites had to go forward. They had to swing their swords. They had to shoot their arrows and do all the things they needed to do to win the battle. But God was working with them. They were co-laborers with God. It says that God sent great hailstones down to destroy their enemy. This is there earlier in chapter 10 here. In verse 11, as they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. But again, the swords of the Israelites are fighting, as well as the hailstones of God are fighting. Again, we ought not think, because the battle is not all the Lord's, that this is somehow different. This is somehow not an expression of a biblical principle. God fights with his people in some cases. And right here in Joshua, in these 5 stories, back to back, we have great diversity in the way God works, great diversity in the way God answers prayers. And all of us, when we're seeking things from God, we ought not to force it into one category or the other. Again, I've been emphasizing one extreme, that sometimes we think it has to be all God, but also the other extreme is just as dangerous. We ought not think that we're going to do everything. We ought not think that it's only through wisdom. We ought not expect a miracle of God. We ought not expect the power of God to be manifested in response to prayer. The diversity in the way God helps the Israelites in these passages illustrates for all of us, we ought to go to God looking for perhaps a Jericho experience where God does just about everything. Perhaps looking at the battle of Ai, where we seem to do everything in guidance from the wisdom of God. But we also maybe look for a co-laborer experience, as in chapter 10. But this is, again, the way that God works in answer to prayer. Lastly, the last 2 questions, we'll take them together. When God wasn't involved, what negative consequences did the people bear, and what negative consequences did God bear? In chapters 7 and chapter 9, we find God not involved because the people didn't seek him. The people in chapter 7 lost lives. There were 36 men, I believe it was, that actually died as a result of them not seeking God. They were embarrassed. Joshua goes before God and he spreads himself out. What shall I say when Israel runs from his enemies? They were embarrassed. And in chapter 9, they end up entering into an alliance with people who should have been their enemies. They should have been destroyed. That's not a good thing. They bore negative consequences as a result of their action. But what about God? What negative consequences did God bear as a result of their not seeking God? Again, in chapter 7, not only were the Israelites embarrassed, but God was embarrassed. Again, the culture of the time was that it was a battle between gods, the gods of Jericho, the gods of Ai, the gods of the Amorites, the gods of these people were at war with the God of the Israelites. And if the Israelites lost, God lost. No longer could people say, oh, this is the undefeated God of Israel who brought them out of Egypt and dried up the Red Sea, dried up the Jordan. No longer could they say that he's undefeated, because here he is defeated because of Israel's misstep. And I think this is something we can all relate to. I know it's been an experience of my life that I have not sought God as I should have. I have not prayed about something when I knew God was calling me to pray about it. It was a place where I needed divine help. I needed God to get involved, and I wasn't faithful in prayer, or I wasn't following some of the wisdom that God has given me. I wasn't faithful in something, either at work or with my relationships or something else, my finances or something like that. I wasn't faithful. I wasn't responsible. And because of that, there was loss. Because of that, there was failure. And unfortunately, relatives who may know me, co-workers who may know me, neighbors who may know me, friends who may know me, who know that I'm a person who is supposedly calls on God, I take the name of Christian on myself, they're looking and saying, maybe your God isn't so great after all. Maybe it's not worth doing all the things you're doing, going to church and reading the Bible and praying. Maybe it's not worth it since you do those things and still your life looks similar to ours. You're still failing like us. And so not only do we suffer loss when we don't seek God, God suffers loss because now people have a lower conception of the power and the goodness of our God. But I want to jump to chapter 9 and 10. What was the negative consequence that God bore? Really, chapter 10 shouldn't be in the Bible. There should be no war between the people of Canaan and the Gibeonites in which the Israelites were defending the Gibeonites. That shouldn't have happened, because if the people had sought God in chapter 9, there would be no chapter 10. They wouldn't have been defending the Gibeonites. But I want you to notice something. In chapter 10, God comes, and that's the place where we saw in verse 14, it said, God was fighting for Israel, even in the time when Israel, without seeking God, incurred this debt, if you will. We could use the example of if I were to go and get a credit card in my name and spend up an exorbitant amount of money. It has a high interest rate, and then my wife doesn't even know about it. I didn't talk to her about it, didn't ask her if she thought it was a good idea. And then later, she has to go pick up a part-time job so that she can help me pay off that debt. That's what God did in chapter 10. God helped the Israelites to fight off the enemies of the Gibeonites when God didn't authorize that alliance with Gibeon in the first place. But we don't even find God complaining. We don't even find God rebuking them. And as I mentioned, this also has been my experience. That God in his mercy, when even though I put myself, because of my negligence, because of my not seeking God, because of my not following God's wisdom, because of my irresponsibility, I put myself and God in a bad situation. I give opportunity for people to think less of God because of my mistakes. Even then, I've seen God's faithfulness. Even then, I've seen God help to restore what was lost. I've seen God work to bring me back into a good light and bring me back into good esteem in the eyes of people, and even to restore their high conception of my God as a result of it. That's the God we serve. And I think this also highlights that even when we're not faithful, God remains faithful still. So let's trust God. Let's seek God. Let's work with him like we saw in chapter 10. Let's work even when he doesn't seem to be working, as we saw in chapter 8, and let's trust him when he is working. The battle is his only, as we saw in chapter 10. And may God bless you as you seek him.